All right, why don't we go ahead and get started here? So, welcome everybody. My name is Josh Braultheim. I am the trainer from Sumo Logic, training manager. And what we're going to be going over today is metrics mastery. So we're going to be talking about metrics. If you've joined other classes before, we've probably focused a little bit more on logs, but this class is devoted to metrics and understanding how metrics can be utilized in Sumo Logic. So I have some slides. We'll do some labs. We'll make today fairly interactive. Like our other classes, this is a 3-hour class. We'll devote 2 hours to content, labs, demos, that kind of stuff. And then we'll set aside about an hour for the exam, which we'll take later, and I'll get into that when we get into that. So let me go ahead and let's just start here for some slides to start with. So the course agenda, this is what we'll be covering, pretty much for today. Yeah, this is a pretty good outline, good steps of what we'll go over. I'm going to skip over this slide for right now. Well, I'll show you how to access the training in a little bit, but I wanted to set some definitions, terms, things like that before we get into the lab. So we will do them just probably about another maybe half hour or so. Reviewing some of the basics. So I am not going to do this demo. You may have seen it before. I'm hoping you have, which is the Travelogic demo. And what we do in that demo is we go through a use case where a fictitious company called Travelogic is seeing a drop in booking. So this is a flight travel agency website, similar to like an Expedia or something like that. And users can go in and book their flights, book their hotels, although not as much this week, of course, but currently they can go ahead and do that. And so in the demo, what we show is we get an indication that there's an issue with our Travelogic website, specifically around the checkout service, meaning people can't check out, they can't book those flights, and that might be part of the problem. So in that demo, we use alerts to start to see, get notifications. We look at a Slack message, we get an email alert. We use our dashboard to start to see what might be going on or not going on, as the case may be. And then for that demo, we start to go into the metrics. We start to look at, we see a CPU increase. We see an increase in gateway latency, in bookings themselves. Bookings start to drop and things like that. And so those metrics help us identify what's going on. And like I said, we're going to dig into that portion in a lot more detail now. And then for the other part of that demo, we use the logs to identify why it's happening. And so today we're going to focus on the metrics, which are what's going on. So what are metrics? Hopefully you kind of know, and if you don't, that's why you're here, and we're going to teach you what they are. So metrics themselves are going to be a set of data points that measure the value of something. So like it says on the top here, it's going to measure the value of something, and typically over time. Sumo customers use Sumo to collect metrics that can measure infrastructure, like operating system performance, disk activity, application performance, all these different metrics that can be gathered. And then metrics are an effective tool for monitoring, troubleshooting, and identifying the root cause of problems. So here we see some everyday metrics, not related to Sumo Logic specifically, but just metrics that might occur in your normal day to day. Measurements of temperature, which is a bit more relevant the past couple of weeks. Things like that, so you can start to see here's what it was at one point, here it was as another point over time, and now you can start to see trends, and we'll go into what you can do with these metrics. Your weight once a week. So if you have a child that you're measuring their height or weight, either one, and you start to see those increase or decrease. Hopefully not the height decreasing. These are also metrics of data points. They measure something, in this case height or weight, and they're tracked over time. Let's see here. Just had to mute something there. Okay, sorry about that, I apologize. So what we're going to look at are some examples of how metrics can be used in our environments or your environment, so that we can start to look at KPIs or key performance indicators over time to look into that visibility into application performance, determining if an outage has occurred and restoring service, and things like that. So those are just some examples of metrics. So how are logs different from metrics? Well, as it says here, these are both data points, but they do differ. Logs are going to record the events that have occurred, while metrics are going to be a numeric measurement of the data collected over time. So one way I like to think about it, and hopefully you will as well, is logs can be more verbose where metrics will be more of a singular data point. So for example, our logs might show that yesterday at this time, I placed an order on the Travelogic website for tickets to New York, you know, for this amount. And that would be the log, would have all those kind of components in there. Where the metric might be tickets sold too, because that's how many tickets I purchased for my trip. So here's a little, I have this little review here of whether it's a log or a metric. So I'll kind of, you don't need to enter in the chat of whether you think it is one or the other. Although feel free to use the chat if you have any questions. I should have mentioned that earlier, so I apologize for that. But the chat is a great way to ask those questions. But so wind patterns for the last 24 hours, is that a log or a metric? Well, that would be a metric because we're measuring a specific thing, the wind pattern, over a period of time. What about every time the wind exceeds 40 knots or 20 knots? Now that would be a log. Looking at the CPU uptime for the last 15 minutes, that would be a metric because we're looking at those specific points over time. Looking at failed logins, these would be logs. Now, if we were counting the amount of failed logins, that might be a metric. But if we're looking at just failed logins and the things that go with them, then we're looking at logs, or logs would be what we'd want to use there. And then if we wanted to look at the number of server errors on an hourly basis, once again, we have that point, or that thing we want to measure, the point of data, and then we have a period of time, and that's what's needed to establish that it's going to be using the metric. So just a little kind of quiz there for you guys. This slide you may have seen before, you may have not. I'm going to go over it quickly because I think it's a helpful slide. What we're trying to show here is, as it says at the top of the screen, Sumo Logic data flow. So within Sumo Logic, there's essentially 3 steps to the data flow. The first is collection. We'll talk about collection a little bit today, and we'll go through some examples. But at a high level, your data is out there in the world, specifically your metrics, because that's what we're focusing on today. But your logs and your metrics and other data is out there. And in order for Sumo Logic to help you with it, the data needs to be collected and brought into Sumo Logic. So you'll use what we call a collector, and I'm going to go over that shortly, so I don't want to dig into that at this point yet. But you'll use a collector that will collect the logs and bring them into Sumo Logic. So at step 2 now, you have your data. It's sitting in Sumo Logic. It's sitting in possibly just a general index or just a big bucket. And now you need to start to do something with that data. And that's where step 2 comes in. Using the operators and charts, starting to search and analyze that data, essentially slice and dice the data. Take the data as just a big chunk of data and starting to divvy it up to look at those things that may be more important to you or others. And then step 3 is that visualizing and monitoring. Once again, kind of as I showed in that other slide, getting those alerts so that you can know via email or via Slack that things are going on or not going on. Same thing with dashboards, so that maybe you look at the data using the query language. Maybe you just prefer a big dashboard that says green good, red bad, and that's a more simplistic way for you and your team to understand the data. And both are correct, no wrong way of doing it. Collecting metrics. So now we're going to get a touch deeper into that first step of collection. So what I'm trying to show with this slide is the fact that everything needs to eventually end up into the Sumo Logic cloud. I'm kind of using air quotes for cloud, but that's the destination of where everything needs to arrive to so that you could search it. But as described, your data is not there yet. It's around the world. It might be in the cloud, it might be on a server farm, it might be on your laptop, it might be on some bare metal servers, it probably is on a combination of many of those. So the end result is the same, data gets in Sumo Logic, but getting the data into Sumo Logic is where things can, where you have options really. So on the left-hand side of the screen, what I'm trying to show here, and I'll have another slide that will go into it a little bit more detail, but I'm trying to show cloud-based properties, newer technologies, things like Azure, GCP, AWS, etc. So in order for data to come into Sumo Logic, you need to use what we call a collector, and that's what this plus is representing. But in the hosted collector environment, there's not a place to install a collector. The collector is a lightweight application that does need to be installed in your environment and does listen for logs and then sends them over. But in a hosted environment, that environment doesn't exist. You can't really install a collector someplace because these are typically ephemeral environments. They're going to be stood up, done, something will occur with them, and then they'll be stood down. And so that collector doesn't have a place to reside. So with the hosted collector, what you would do is you would basically provide us, Sumo Logic, or enter the credentials in the UI, and then on your behalf, we would grab the data. So you would say, essentially, my AWS data is here. Here is my username and password, or role account information, as they call it. And then we, on your behalf, grab that data. And you have access to the UI to adjust, the passwords and things like that, those credentials. So that's that side of things are in the cloud. Through the cloud, they're kept in the Sumo cloud, and the data is there to search. On the right-hand side, though, you have installed collectors, and you have two different flavors of them, if you will. Same collector, just how you utilize them or implement them. So with the installed collector, this is the case where you do not have your data in the cloud. You have your data in a server farm, your laptop, more of a, like I alluded to, like a bare metal, device or environment. So data needs to arrive to Sumo Logic. So how does it get to Sumo Logic? Well, you're still going to utilize a collector represented by these pluses, but you're going to utilize the collector in a couple different options, or you'll have options. With this, let's do the centralized data collection method first. So here you have a bunch of different machines that are producing data. And what you can do is you can install the collector somewhere in your environment, or multiple collectors. And many of our customers have hundreds, thousands of collectors. But install the collector somewhere in your environment. The collector will go ahead and collect a lot of data and then send it to Sumo Logic. So that's one method of having your data reach a centralized application, if you will, and then that application sends over to Sumo Logic. The other variation on that is local data collection. What would occur here is the collector would be installed on each device, and then those devices on their own would connect to Sumo Logic and the data would be collected. So the decision between the two, and it's not necessary that you get too bogged down in the details, but the main consideration is, do you want the collector installed on every device? And as a result, do you want every device open to the internet with a limited range? It's not full internet exposure, but do you want to open that device and allow it to send data to Sumo Logic? Yes or no? Maybe, maybe not. I mean, you may, but there are potentially security concerns of, do I want all the devices on my network or in my environment having the ability to reach out to Sumo Logic to send data? That's up to you. That's quite a kind of powerful decision. So we give you this option of taking the installed collector and just installing it in two different ways, that centralized or the local data collection. And with those, as well as with the hosted collector, you may use multiples. So many organizations will have some data come in through the hosted collector, some through a centralized data collection, some through local data collection. It's just whatever suits your needs. This slide here is around collecting metrics, as it says. And what we're trying to show here is similar to the previous slide, just a little more expanded out with those metric sources. So what we see here are a bunch of different metric sources: AWS, GCP, Azure, Kubernetes. I mean, you can read the boxes. And so the end goal here is to show that all the data, one way or another, needs to be collected and brought into the Sumo Logic Cloud. So that's really what we're trying to show here. And all these different methods or data formats are fully supported. And we'll look at some of those today. So you can use host metrics to bring in on an installed collector, CPU, memory, TCP information. If you want to bring in Docker stats information, you can, so that you can start to bring in your Docker container metrics, the CPU, the memory usage, network IO, et cetera. AWS CloudWatch, same idea. You can start to bring in all these. I'm not going to go through each little bucket here, but the same holds true. You have these metrics, you can bring them into Sumo Logic. And we'll start to do that as an exercise soon. All right. This next slide Is very similar to the other one. But what we're trying to show here is this is more general. It's actually really kind of the same slide, just a different view of it. But what we're once again trying to show is here's the Sumo Logic Cloud. Here's all these different environments that are producing metrics. And long story short, they need to be brought into the Sumo Logic Cloud. So ingestion and storage. Probably worth mentioning. So you have the ability to customize the retention period for this data. So as you collect the metrics data, or as it's collected in Sumo Logic, how long do you want it to be retained? You get to decide. You know, if you only need the data for the past, I don't know, 2 weeks, you probably don't need to retain it for 30 days. It's just not data you need to go back to. So this gives you the ability to start to customize those different roll-ups of whether it's retained, whether it's stored in 1 minute buckets or 1 hour, and then starting to decide how long those are retained within the system. All right, let's see, any questions? No questions, I'll take that as a good sign. Let's go through a couple, I'm just jumping ahead just to make sure. Yeah, let's go through, let me go through this one or two next slides, and then we'll jump into the collection and get that rolling. So as we start to look at metrics, what we can start to do is we can utilize key value pairs, and we'll look at how those are created shortly. But we can start to utilize those to start to look at our data and break it down into different groupings, I guess you could say. So for example, on this top line here, we have the metric related to wind speed, the region, and the country in Spain. So let's say our goal is to look at wind speed in Spain for the last 24 hours. So using this format right here, we could go ahead and say, show us the wind speed for the country of Spain. And what it's going to do is, as it says here, if we have 255 stations, we are going to see 255 unique metrics plotted in the same graph, which is going to be quite noisy because you're going to have 255 data points essentially. But what we can do is starting to utilize the key value pairs, we can start to limit what we want to look at. So now if we only wanted to look at those metrics associated with Valencia, which is a city in Spain, we could simply use the filtering to start to say, don't show us everything in Spain, just show us city equals Valencia. And now instead of getting all 255 stations, we're now getting 3. And then we could start to continue with the query, or continue with the query, and go ahead and implement an average. With this one here, we're saying, show us the 3 stations individually, station 1, station 2, and station 3. Here we're saying, take those 3 stations and average them to give me a singular set of data, one particular line that's going to go up and down to represent average. So all of it's the same, but different. So it just depends on what kind of granularity you want to get into your data. And kind of, good things is we give you controls to decide. So many options. With the metrics, there are operators. So as you hopefully are aware of, with logs, there's operators. With metrics, there's operators as well. Operators, for those of you not aware, are simply actions that you can have the system take. Figure out the average, the sum, filter, and many others, and we'll cover some of these today. So they're similar to the log operators. They're also different. So you have some differences there. So I would encourage you, as you want to get into these metrics or learn more about them, start to look at the metrics operators. So we have a help article that will go ahead and, just to show it to you real fast, shows us those operators, some syntax, and then some examples, which is really quite helpful. All right, let's go back to here. And yeah, let's go ahead and let's jump into the lab. So I'm going to go ahead and back up to where the lab logins are. Sorry, there we go. So how are we going to get to the labs? Excuse me. So what we're going to do is we're going to log into service.sumologic.com, but we're not going to use our corporate or professional or personal account. We're going to use a training account because we have training data. So go ahead and log in using the username of training plus user with number. And the number is going to represent a number between 0001 and 800. So maybe you want to be training plus user 652 or 347, just pick some numbers. And then for the password, we're going to utilize the password of Logic Lab. So capital L, 0, so it's a 0 in there, GIC, capital L, ABS, exclamation point. So I'm going to go ahead, let me go ahead and paste that into the chat and go ahead and log in. If you have any problems logging in, go ahead and just give a shout. And just use a 3-digit sequence. If for some reason the 3-digit sequence doesn't work because you get password not active or something like that, just try a different set. In the very near future, we're going to start to email these ahead of time to you guys, so you'll start to get your own customized training accounts. But for right now, this is a shared environment. So as with any shared environment, keep in mind it is shared. Don't put anything proprietary in here. It does get deleted periodically, those kind of caveats. So. All right, if everybody's logged in, I'm going to kind of assume everybody is, just because nobody's screamed yet. So, but if you do need to, then go ahead. And when we log in, we should be brought to a screen that looks pretty similar to this, which is the home screen. You may have a bunch of tabs at the top. If you want to close them, just go ahead and go to one of them, click on the 3 dots and just click on close all tabs. But ultimately, I'd like you to get to a screen that's pretty close to this at least. And now what we're going to do is we're going to go to certification. And under certification, we have our certifications. Now, we're not going to take one yet, unless you're really feeling adventurous, but I wouldn't encourage you to take it right now. But what I do want to do is use the labs that are associated with this certification. So if you scroll down under Metrics Mastery, should be hands-on labs. So just go ahead and click on that. And now you should have the labs. So in one tab, you should have the application, Sumo Logic. In one tab, you should have the labs, and possibly in another tab, you might have the Zoom or something like that. So we're going to go through these labs. We're going to go through most of them, but we will do some of them. Then we'll go back to the slide deck and introduce concepts and then kind of flip back and forth. But for the first, about first 4 labs, I want to go through those right now. So let's go through those right now. So the first step that I want to do is install the collector. So you may have done this before. If not, this is going to be, I was going to say fun. I don't know how fun it will be, but you know, it will be kind of interesting. And what we're doing with installing the collector is to take even a step back in the labs is we want to start to look at some metrics. Specifically, we want to look at some host metrics. Specifically, we want to look at those host metrics associated with your laptop. So on your laptop, you now have metrics related to CPU and throughput and storage and all these different metrics. Well, let's go ahead and bring those into Sumo Logic and examine them. Now, how do we get these metrics that right now reside on your laptop into Sumo Logic? Well, they don't magically get there. We need to do something. And that's why we're going to install the collector. So the first step we'll do is installing the collector, which is setting up that application to grab those logs or metrics, in this case metrics, but it can do double duty. So let's go ahead and start to set this up. So let's go ahead and click on Lab 1, installing a collector. What we're going to need to do first, although in no real particular order, but we might as well just do it. Actually, you know what, let's download the collector first. So what I want you to do, and I'll probably rewrite these steps, is for Lab 1, let's go straight to step 5. And we'll do 5 through 10 or so, and then we'll go back to the other steps. So I prefer doing it this way. So to do these steps, we're going to go home, and we're going to go to manage data on the black bar. If you don't see the black bar, it might be hidden. Just go to the 3 dots or the 3 horizontal lines. Some people call it a hamburger menu. Click on that, and now we see the black bar. Now we're going to go to manage data, and we're going to choose collection. When we go to collection, what we're seeing are those collectors, those agents, if you will, that are set up or at least configured to go ahead and grab data out there. But in this case, we need to set up a new one because now we want to grab the data from our laptop. So how do we set up a new one? We go to Add Collector on the top right. And now we're going to choose the type of collector we want to utilize. As described earlier, we can choose installed or hosted, hosted being cloud data, installed being more, well, not cloud data. So we're going to choose installed because we want to choose the collector that's going to be relative to where our data is. So we're going to install the collector on our laptop and then ingest that data. So select installed collector and then select the flavor of operating system you're using. So we have, as you see here, Linux, Windows, Mac. We have some other versions as well. So I'm going to click on the OS, Mac OS version because I'm on a Mac. And then it's going to start to download. It's going to be about a 90 meg download. It should take, well, I guess it depends, on your bandwidth and all that, but it should be pretty quick. So now I've downloaded the collector, and hopefully you have as well. And just as a reminder for those steps, if you're at home, go to Manage Data, go to Collection, go to Add Collector, choose Installed Collector, and then choose the flavor, and then you should have the download. Now, once you have the download, let's go ahead and run the download. And I'm going to start to, if you haven't reached this step yet, just catch up. It's not going to be that difficult. The installation is like really any other installation. So I'm going to run the DMG. I'm going to choose to install the app. I am going to get these security prompts because my laptop is a little bit locked down. So now I'm opening it. And now it's setting up an installed wizard like any other application. And for the most part, I'm really just going to follow the steps here like any other application. So where did it go? Here it is. So it is prompting me to enter, I have some security on my laptop. And now it's going through the traditional prompts of a setup wizard. So I'm going to click next, get license terms and agreements, going to blindly accept these and click accept. Decide where I want to install this application. So I'll just install it to where it suggests. And now it's preparing to install the application. Once again, not anything radically new. It'll take a few moments to extract the files like any other application. And now it's going to start to install them. Now, on this screen, it's going to give us some options as to what we want to both name the collector as well as some other settings. I'm going to jump into the advanced settings. We're not really going to change any today, but I do want to point out just a couple, just because. The first thing I want to point out is the collector name. By default, the collector name will be your computer name, which is not bad. I think that's good, but you do have the ability to modify that. So in this case, I'm going to encourage you to keep your collector name as your computer name, assuming it's fairly unique. So that way I can see mine is Jay Brothheim and Bob can see Bob's and so on and so forth. But you can modify that if you want to. The other thing you can do in here, I mean, you can do a bunch of other things, but if you need a proxy to reach that, exit out to the internet, you can do so and set those up right here. But in this case, I'm just going to click next just because I do want to keep that collector name as my computer name. So I'm going to go ahead and click next again because I want to use these settings. Now at this point, this is where we're going to go back to the lab and do those steps that I skipped over earlier. Because at this point, we need to tell the system or the application or the collector how we want it to authenticate. It is now about to call back to Sumo Logic, but it needs permission to do so, or at least credentials to do so. So how do we do that? Well, we're going to use an access ID key pair for that. So in this screen, we're going to select access key and click next. And now we're going to have an access ID and key blank of where we need to enter that data. But to do so, now we're going to go back to the lab and we're going to go back to step 1 and look to or see how to create that key. So to do so, we're going to go to our user. We're going to go to, so on the bottom left should be, it should say Sumo user number, whatever you have. We're going to choose preferences. And we should have this section that says add access keys. There may be access keys already created, not relevant. We're going to create a new one. And when we click add access key, we're going to give it a name. And for the name, I would just once again encourage you to use your computer name, which is your collector name, your initials, just something semi-unique. Yeah, I'm just gonna call mine JB test 3. Not feeling very creative. And just click create key. We don't need to worry about the domain portion for now. Now, when I click create key, what's occurring is a key is being created. I am now given an access ID, and access key. And what these are going to be used for is in supplement or to replace my authentication of using my username and password. So what I'm going to do is copy each one of these into the collector screen. So where's my collector installation? So I'm going to go ahead and grab the access ID, copy it, paste it in. Going to copy the access key and paste it in. Now, I want to do those correctly. I mean, I want to do everything correctly, but certainly want to make sure I did those correctly. When I click done here, this will be the last time that I ever see the access key. So if I needed to keep this in some sort of locker environment or whatever, this would be the point where I'd want to put it in a notepad. Well, not notepad, probably something a little more secure, but in some sort of locker environment. But otherwise, I'm going to click done. And now in the collector installation, I'm going to click next. And now what is going to happen is, as it says, please hold while we connect to Sumo Logic. Very simply, the collector on my laptop is now trying to dial out, if you will, and ping pong or ping with Sumo Logic. Since I got to this screen that says finish to exit setup, that means I was able to successfully connect. If you don't get this screen, this means you're not able to connect. Maybe you enter the ID and the key improperly. Maybe you flip-flop them. Maybe you left off a digit or a numeral. Maybe you your laptop or your device is locked down from a firewall standpoint and you can't dial out. Regardless, that's what that message means if you do not get this one. So in this case, I got the good message, so I'm just going to click finish. So now I've installed the collector. So I've done step 1. So now let's go ahead and jump to step 2 or lab 2. Because with lab 1, I now have a collector that has been set up, and I'll show you that in a moment, but I now have a collector that's been set up. But at this point, I haven't given it any instructions on what to collect. So now let's do lab 2 to start to look at those metrics, specifically those host metrics we want to ingest, and show you how to bring those in. So to do so, we're going to go to the collector again. So we're going to go to manage data and collection. And we should now see a whole list of collectors. And what we're going to do now here is we're going to search specifically for our collector. So I'm going to look for my collector using J, first couple letters of my name. You'll go ahead and do the same. And what you should find is, let me get rid of this old one. But what you should find is something that looks really similar to this line, except it should have your name. So it's going to have the computer name or the collector name. It's going to have the type of collector. Is it an installed collector or a hosted collector? It's going to have a status, which is very important. A green check means the status is active or up and running. Basically, what it means is the collector can ping with the with Sumo Logic. A red X would mean that it can't ping and that there might be a connection issue. Now, just because it's a green check, though, doesn't mean that data is being transferred back and forth. It just means the collector is up and running and ready to transfer back and forth. And what we see here in sources and last hour, we see no data has been collected, specifically in the last hour. So what this is telling us is we have a collector, it's set up, it's up and running, it's active, it's awake, whatever kind of adjective you want to use, but it's not receiving any data yet. And that's what we're going to do now, is now get it to receive the data. So how do we do that? Well, in lab 2, what we're going to do is we're going to go to the far right and we're going to click add source. So over here where it says add, if you click on that, you have the ability to add a source, which I'm going to choose. Now, when I choose to add source, I get a bunch of options, or more options. What type of data do I want to add? What is the source of data that I'm about to add? Is it a local file, maybe a log file? Well, no. Is it Docker information? Well, no, not in this case. Specifically, though, what we want to look at in this case are the host metrics. So what we're going to do is just choose host metrics. And now we're going to get into this interface where we're just going to start to identify those host metrics using metadata, source categories, and other descriptors or potentially other descriptors, start to label this data. So on this screen, as it says here, first we're going to go ahead and give the data a name. And so it can be any name you want. I'm going to stick pretty close to the lab. And I'm just going to call it host metrics. I'm going to use my name. And so I'd encourage you to do something similar, something fairly unique. In this case, we don't have many people with repetitive names, so using just the first name is fine. Now what we want to do is we want to go ahead and start to fill some of these out. So for example, the source host. We can enter this in if we want to. Actually, we might as well, just for consistency. So we're going to enter the source host and the source category. And we're going to use these naming conventions that are provided here. So for the source host, go ahead and use your collector name or computer name. And for the source category, go ahead and use host metrics / once again, your name. And then let me catch up and then I'll show you what to do with the others. So for this one is going to be my computer name. And then for this one, we're going to use that host metrics / username. I'm just going to copy this because I'm going to use this a few times today. The scan interval, how frequently do we want these metrics to be scanned for? The more frequent, the more calls to the collector that are being made, the more data is being transferred back and forth. In this case, I am going to choose a short interval just because I want to get data quick. If I choose 5 minutes, I might have to wait up to 5 minutes to get some data. In this case, I just want data fast, so I'm going to choose 10 seconds, even though it's going to bring in more data, increase message volume, things like that. For this, I just want data fast. And then what metrics do I want to utilize or bring in? CPU, and for each one, it has a lot of sub metrics. Memory, TCP, etc. I'm going to click all 5 because I want all of them. And now I'm going to click Save. When I do, I'm brought back to this screen. But if I go back to the collector screen, now I should see my collector. More specifically, what I should see is my collector and now a source of data represented down here below. So I'll go ahead and just kind of pause to make sure everybody has reached this step where they have a source of data. It's green check. It's looks really similar to this. And what I'm doing here is I'm refreshing to see if any data has come over yet. But now let's go ahead and actually create a query to do that. So let's go ahead and create a query to bring this data in or verify it's there. That's what I'm doing this just to make sure I didn't make a typo in mine. What you should start to see is a graph populated over here. But let's go ahead and continue with the steps. So in lab 3, now we want to use a query to look at these metrics. So what we're going to do here is we're going to go ahead and do a new query using the metrics query. So we're going to go ahead, let me refresh one more time. Okay. We're going to go ahead and go to new, and we're going to go to metrics. So previously you might have gone to the log search, but this is a metrics class, so we're going to focus on metrics. So if you haven't been in the metrics environment before, just to show it, compare it to a log query real quick, it's similar and it's different. So with the metrics, you enter queries. I mean, you have a spot to enter operators and things like that. So someone's saying their collector is not started after the install. Let's see, we can try and help troubleshoot that a little bit later. I guess for now, I would just go ahead and look on, and you'll still be able to use some of the sources of data that I'm using. So you'll should be able to still follow along just using my examples on your device. So we have the metrics, we have queries, we're going to enter those. There's going to be graph, there's going to be time information. So it's similar to a log search, but also quite different. Now, in this case, what we want to do is to start off, we want to do a metric search, excuse me, and we want to look at the CPU load average. So how do we do that? Well, here's how we do that with the query. So I'm just going to take that query and paste it in, and I should get data. So let's see. And lo and behold, I do. Now, what this data is showing me is all these different CPU load average 15 minutes for all these different sources of data. And you might see some of yours. The reason we see all of them is because at this point, we're not saying specifically source host or source category JBrawl time. We're just saying look at metric everything. So now I see, let's see, I see John's data. I see, let's see, I think mine is that purple line or blue line. I see Ian's. There's mine, yeah, so on and so forth. Now this is good, but we can start to get more granular with it as well. So what we'll do in lab 3 to continue is we can utilize the legend to see what data is being plotted. So in this case, we see all these metrics are being plotted. Now, what are those metrics? Whose metrics are they? Well, by going into the legend, now we start to see that. And we see that specifically related to the source host. So here I see my metrics. Here I see John's, here I see Ian's, here I see AWS, and so on and so forth. And what I can do here is now I can start to turn some of these on or off. So if I wanted to just look at my data, for example, I could go ahead and turn off all the other ones. Actually, what I'll do is turn off all the other ones and then just turn mine on. And now we start to see my metric and related to CPU load average of 15 minutes. So now we see that my load average was down and now it's going up, and we start to see those metrics. Now, what I want to show here is to look at the metric just for that one host. And this is just a different way to handle it. So in this example, I went through the legend and turned on those that I wanted to see or not. But what I'm going to do here is I'm going to turn all of them back on. And now I'm going to do it through the query. And the way I'm going to do it through the query is by specifying the host metrics for myself. So when I run this, this should now just show JBrawl times host metrics. And assuming I don't have any typos, there it is. So now I just see my metric. And so that's what we want to show, at least the start of it, is how to look at a bunch of metrics, how to just look at yours, and how to start to create some queries to visualize these. Now, one other thing we can do here is, and this is step 5, is we can look at other metrics compared to one metric compared to another, excuse me. So what we're going to do here is we're going to look at the average. So in the first line, I'm saying, look at my metric related to CPU and load average. The second line, and I haven't hit enter, which is why nothing's showing up yet, I'm saying, look at all the host metrics for CPU, but then average those. So don't look at John's, look at Ian's, look at Bob's, take all of them, add them up, divide by 3 essentially to get the average. So now what I see is, here is the green line is mine, the orange is the average. And so this is showing me that I am kind of below the average. The average is kind of peaking here, and I'm below that, which is good or bad. And you would decide whether it is good or bad, and then what to do with it. Ah, cool. Let's see, no questions. Okay, good. Now, lab 4, we want to introduce the apps, and hopefully you've seen an app before, but if you haven't, well, here's what an app is. Now, what is an app? An app is very simply a query and dashboard, or searches and dashboards that we at Sumo Logic have created for you to utilize. And the reason we can create these is we know what the formats for various logs and metrics are going to look like. We know the structure of a log message, an Apache message versus a CloudTrail message. We know the structure of metrics because that's what we do, that's our job. And so what you can do is start to utilize these queries against your data, have a better way to express the data or dig into it, and barely have to touch the keyboard to do so. So let's go through an example. So to do this, we're going to go to the app catalog. And we're going to look specifically for this app, which is called host metrics. So either scroll alpha or just type host, probably easier to type host, and then just click on the host metrics app. Now, what it's about to provide us is, if we go to preview dashboard, this is what it's about to provide us. This is not our data yet. These are just screenshots. But what it's going to give me is a CPU idle time, average CPU load, more CPU, a lot of CPU, disk use bytes, all these different things that for the right person, it's going to be quite helpful. So to get these things, what I'm going to do is very simply go to Add Library. And for the Add Library step, I'm just going to tell the system where my data is. So what my source category that I'm using is. And if we remember going back to where we created the host metrics source, we should be using the source category of host metrics / our name. So that's what I'm going to specify here. Oop. Sorry. Sorry about that. So what I'm specifying here is the source category equals host metrics / jBrowthon. In the app name, go ahead just for today. Yeah, might as well. Just go ahead and put your initials or something after it, just so it's a touch unique. And then just click Add Library. And now what is happening is my metrics are being taken, or not being taken, just referenced. My queries and dashboards that Sumo Logic has created are being utilized. And the two are being, as I always say, for lack of a technical phrase, being smushed together. And now we get that output. So now if I want to look at my host metrics overview, I am now looking at my CPU idle time, my average load time, all these things. And now I can start to, investigate these. Is this thing's going down? Is that good or bad? Well, maybe, maybe not. And I can start to make decisions on these. So now I'm getting this wonderful insight into my data, but I've yet to really touch the keyboard to do so. If I go back to the host metrics folder here, if I want to go look at, I don't know, let's look at something else. Let's look at memory. Now what I start to see is memory, per host, and whether it's going up, going down, and all these different things. So wanted to show the apps because the apps are a really simple way for you to get insight into your data. As you saw, I barely touched the keyboard to get it, and now I get this information, and I can share this with operations or whoever needs it, or they can view it on their own. All right, so that is Lab 4, which is installing that host metrics app. All right, let's see, any questions? Oh, something else, it does show it in the lab, so I'll show it as well, is we can start to, let me find one here. So let's say here we have this overall average CPU load, and it's tracking 1 minute, 5 minutes, and 15 minutes. What we can do is we can click on this icon that says show in metrics. And what that's going to do is, as the name hopefully implies, is going to show that query in the metrics screen. So now what we see are each line representing 1 minute, 5 minutes, and 15 minutes. And what we can do here is we can start to click on these query lines and start to turn them off. So maybe I just want to look at 5 minutes. I can click on the 1 minute, click on the 15 minute, and now I'm just looking at that 5 minute. And so that's some easy functionality to turn off lines of the query or include them, and very easy to do so. Almost like commenting a line in the query language of 2 slashes, but easier. It's just clicking one button. All right, so that's Lab 4. I'm going to go ahead and jump into the slide deck just for a few. Let me see. I'm not a big slide fan, so I try to stay out of it when I can, but there are some good reasons for us to utilize it. Let's go ahead and let's do these labs as well. Let's see. Sorry, yeah, let's look at these labs as well. These are typically optional, but time-wise, I think we're doing okay. So let's run through these. So the first one I want to do is Lab 5, which is joined metrics queries. So what this is going to show us how to use are to use some of those operators, specifically the mathematical ones, to go ahead and start to, like I said, slice and dice your data, if you will. So what we want to do here is we're going to go ahead and open a new metrics window. So new metrics. And what we want to do is we want to start to bring in some data. The data we want to look at first is the incoming rate of traffic or incoming traffic. And we want to measure it as a result of rate as well as sum. So to do so, I'm just going to grab the query line. We're not really creating queries, but we are utilizing this. So I'm just going to grab that line and paste it into the first box. Now, when I run that, I get exactly what I requested. I get my net in bytes measured by the rate and the sum of those. Now what I want to do is I want to look at the rate and sum of bytes, but in this case, I want to look at out bytes. In that case, I was looking at in, but I want to look at out bytes now. So what I'm going to do is take this metric, copy and paste it into the second line. Now, what we can do here and what the lab is showing us is the fact that we can start to use these, I was going to say joins, they're not joins in the same way that we use joins with subqueries, but you can start to utilize these queries together in this form of an expression. So as we start to create these lines, they are automatically going to be tagged with a label or a letter, actually. So the first line is going to be A, the second line is going to be B. So what we can do is if we want to subtract the out bytes from the in bytes, we can just very simply say B minus A. And now when we run that, we get that metric here. And it's all kind of lumped together, so it's a little hard to read. Let me see if I make it a smaller window, it might be a little clearer. Yeah. And this is lab data, so it's replicating, but you can certainly see that it's doing both portions here. And then we can see just the B and the A, just the differences. So what we want to show here is the fact that you can start to take these metrics and input them, but then start to use the query labels. I don't know if that's the formal name for it, but those A's and B's to start to say, you know, divide A by B or minus B from A or so on and so forth. And so we could start to call the values from these queries and start to put them in an equation quite simply, which is pretty cool. And so now, as it says here, now we're left, if we turn off the A and the B, what we're left with is just a list of our, not a list, but a line chart of our rate of traffic over time. So we see it went up, it went down, you know, so on and so forth. Okay, good. Lab 6 is introducing the idea or the ability to filter the time series. So in this case, if we want to filter our metrics, we can go ahead and do so. And we can also filter using some of these metrics operators. So we can filter, which we'll show using one way, but you can also use top K and bottom K. And if you remember from, if you've seen them in logs, they do kind of what they sound like. They allow you to take the top X and only look at those. So if you have a long list of stuff and you only want to look at the top 10, top K, top 10, and you can start to do so. But let's look at an example, a real example. So the example we're going to use here is looking at the metrics. And something else that I want to show when I do a new metric search is I can go ahead and, like with the log search, the search ahead or type ahead is going to help me. So if I do metric equals, this is showing me a list of all, or at least most of them, actually it should be all of them, all the metrics that exist within the 15-minute period I'm looking at. Now, that can be good, or we can go ahead and specify the metric we want to look at. And that's what we're going to do right here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab this example and just paste it in. And also customize it so that I'm looking at my metrics. And like I said, if your metrics are not working, if you just want to copy my example using my source category, that's fine. You should still see the results. So what I'm going to do now is click. Actually, before I do that, I'm going to get rid of this filter here. So what I'm doing right now is I'm just saying, show me the metrics related to my metrics, so related to JBrawlTime, specifically around CPU system metrics. And when I click start, I now get all these different metrics. Now with the filtering, what I can start to do is say, only show me metrics that exist within a certain range. So what I can do here is now say, let's set up a min and a max and only show me the metrics when they fall into that range. Now, in this case, not the greatest example, because if I get rid of my filter, I see that my metrics are within a range of about, it's about 6.9 to about 15. Well, what I'm saying here with the filter is saying, only show me if the metric is above 20 and below 50, so within that range of 20 to 50. Now, in this example, I don't have any values, so that's why nothing shows up. But if I did, and I have an extra slash, but if I did modify this to, let's say, this being 5, now I start to see those things because it's within my filter range. So that's what the filter can be used for, to filter stuff. Probably obvious that that's what a filter would do, but that's certainly an example of how it can be used. Another example, let's see if this one works, but is we could go ahead and say, just show us the metric of CPU and show us where the filter average is greater than 95. So let's see if this works. So I'll do a new metric, paste it in. And actually, before I put the filter in, let's just look at the CPU in general. So here my CPUs are all over the place because remember, I'm looking at all the CPUs, not just JBrawl time. Now I'm going to say, just show me those CPUs that are greater than 95, or the average. And now I see none. And so this might be a good indication. What this is showing me is, while there have been CPU ranges, over the last 15 minutes, none of them have averaged over 95, meaning maybe none of them are hitting that critical, you need to be aware that they're running out of memory or what have you. So this can allow you to start to filter for when those occur, which is certainly helpful. All right, cool, let's keep going here. Let's go, let's see, I have some slides on AWS. I guess I'll go through these. So let's see, we're just about here. So now we're going to look at some AWS metrics. Previously, we were looking at host metrics because we were taking metrics from your device, which was the host, and sending them over. But now we want to look at some AWS ones. So AWS metrics are collected via CloudWatch, and we have some already in the training environment, and that's what we're going to utilize. So we're really just going to dig into these. So you may be using AWS, you may not, but certainly it's quite a common method of gathering metrics. And so let's go ahead and let's just dive in here. I don't want to go through the specifics of every AWS metric and what it does, but they're all very thoroughly documented by Amazon. So what I'm trying to show here on this screen is the hosted collector setup. So as we went through the install collector, but there is also the hosted collector. So in this case, the data is out there in the cloud in AWS, and we need to bring it into Sumo Logic. And so that's what's being represented here. I don't believe we're going to go through all these steps in the labs. I just wanted to show them just a little bit more at a high level, just so you're aware of the blanks you need to fill in. But it's really just kind of fill in the blanks. Yeah, same idea here with AWS metrics. Some things to remember: only send necessary metrics. If you don't need to send us all the metrics, don't, because they take up space and eventually you'll get charged for them. So like with anything, just bring in the data you need. Choosing the right scan intervals, kind of like I talked about a little bit earlier. You can set the scan intervals from with CloudWatch from 1 minute to 5 minutes. Setting them too frequently might bring in more data than's been expected. Bringing in not enough data could leave you waiting for the data to come in. So you'll need to really just kind of find that sweet spot for yourself of how frequently you want to bring it in. And you have the customization of deciding, for this set of data, I want it to come in every minute. For this other data, I only look at this data once a month, and maybe I just have it come in every 5 minutes because there's no urgency with it at all. those are really kind of the other highlights. We'll send this deck over to you, so I'll send it so you can look at these in more detail on your own time. So now let's look at Lab 7. So let's do Lab 7. So so many windows. So if we go to Lab 7, we're looking at AWS Metrics. So what we're going to do is look at an example. Now, in this example, we're assuming the metrics have already been collected. So in this case, we or I have set up the hosted collector to bring those metrics in, similar to the screens I showed a few moments ago. But now I want to go through how do you query those and what to do with these AWS metrics. So in this case, we're using ALB data, just another set of data. So what we can do is we can start very simply by grabbing this first query and going to a new log search, a new metric search. I'm sorry, I keep doing that. Force of habit. And so with the new metric search, simply paste in the query, and we can see both is there any metrics data, and more specifically looking at the metrics data associated with ALB, associated with AWS, and more specifically associated with lab data. So first, let's see, is there any data even in here? And there is, so that's good. This means we at least have something we can start to play with. So all this data has been ingested, but now what we're going to start to do is start to fine tune what we're looking at. So as we showed earlier with the legend, when we go to the legend, we now see all, I don't know, whether probably about 10, actually there's a lot more, different sets of data. Actually, there's a lot of them. Oh, look at all these. So with the legend, we're starting to see all those different sources of data. But what we can do now is we can use specific metrics to look for specific things. So rather than looking at all the data, what if I just want to look at server errors? And server errors are identified by the status code starting with a 5. So what I can do is I can go ahead and just copy this query. I can either do a new query, or I can just do the same one and just turn off the other thing. And now when I run this, what I should get are only those metrics related to five errors. Let's see, there should be some in there. Let me expand the time range. That's strange. I apologize for that. There was data just yesterday. Unless I have a typo in here. Let's see, 5A. I apologize for that. I'm not quite sure why there isn't. So there's all this data. Oh, here it is. I apologize. I should have clicked that button first. So now what we see is all these metrics data. It's a lot of different data, all these different environments. You can see the availability name is changing, but these are all different metrics that are being brought in that show the 5x account. Now, what we can then do is start to compare this average to something else. So we can start to take these other queries and look at the average. So here, for example, and let me turn this off. Now we should, okay, so now we see the average. So what I'm looking at now is taking all those different metrics related to ELB 500s and saying just take the average. Now I'm getting a singular number or singular metric around all of those. Now this is good. This is letting me know this is the error count over the past 6 hours. And I see it goes up, it goes down. But I don't really know, is this good or not? I need to compare it to something else. And so what we want to show here is the ability for you to utilize a time shift. What I'm doing on, let me just paste it in first. But what I'm doing on this third line is I'm saying, take the average over the last 6 hours. What I'm saying here is do a time shift of 1 day. Still do the last 6 hours, but now go to yesterday's last 6 hours. So instead of comparing, so instead of looking just at today, we're now looking at yesterday as well. So here, for example, I see a spike in ELBs. Well, compared to yesterday, it was much lower. Maybe that's concerning. Maybe I now want to zoom in on that moment of time and figure out why today we're getting so many more 500 error counts compared to yesterday. Maybe new code, maybe the server's down, maybe. But these are starting to give me those metrics to start to see those things and then decide how to act on that. So what we wanted to show here is just using AWS as an example, but then also starting to utilize the time shift to look at different time periods to see this is what was going on here, this was going on there, and then decide, is that good or bad, and do something about it. All right, I'm going to skip over the rest of labs. Yeah, I'm going to skip over the rest of this one for now and jump into lab 8. Now, lab 8 is using the travel logic as an example. So I did not show this example, so I apologize for that. I'm hoping you have seen it before. And in the future, I probably should do it. But what this example is as a reminder, is travel logic demo. We have this fictitious website. We show that people are booking. We show that there are people not booking successfully. Then we start to use the logs to figure out why people are not booking, and that's kind of the example. So what I want to do here, though, is I want to start to look at some of those logs, assuming they're working. I kind of have my fingers crossed here, but let's go ahead and start to look at these. So to start with, I'm going to look at this metric here. And the metric here is related to travel, training, which is just our training environment, travel, checkout, bookings, specifically the success count. So what I'm basically saying here is show me those successful bookings in account format or form. So if I paste this in, I should start to see bookings. So what I'm seeing here is over the last 15 minutes, people were booking. There was an increase in bookings, a decrease, more of a decrease, increase, decrease, so on and so forth, which may be helpful, may not be. And at this point, I don't know that it is helpful. It's just showing me bookings are going up and down, which is going to happen just throughout the day. But what we want to show here is the ability to use the key value tags. And actually, I didn't show those yet. Let me see. Oh, I should have shown those first. I'm going out of order. Let me see here. Let me show it in here, and then I'll show it in the documentation, in the slideshow. So what I'm showing here is I want to kind of take the bookings and look at the metric equal to success. And what this should give me is the same thing. And it does. So what I see here is orange is representing one line, green is representing the other. But what I want to show here is the fact that these are equal, but how do we make them equal? And that's what I want to show in the lab, in the slide deck. So if we go back to the example earlier of the wind speeds in Spain, what we see here are, or what we want to mention here, are the fact that metrics can have different formats. So we can normalize these using key value pairs. And so we have something called metrics rules, which allow this to be set up. So I'll show that in a moment. Actually, here's an example of it. So within the interface, there's the ability to set up metrics rules. And so what I've done here is I've started to set one up. These are similar to field extraction rules, where the system is going to look at a set of data. It's going to look through that data to identify certain fields or certain stuff, and then parsing those out essentially as fields that you can utilize in your queries. So what we're doing here is we're creating we're saying here, look at the travel stuff. Look at all those metrics related to travel. And then go ahead and parse these portions out using the metric itself. So each metric has travel.training, .something, .something. And we're going to start to use those patterns within those dots to recognize those variables as fields. So this first thing might be just as an example, this might be the node, this might be the pod, this might be the metric, this might be the namespace, and so on and so forth. And then within the lab, what we're going to do is start to utilize those, and that's what I was starting to show. So if we go back to the lab, now we see here we're using just a traditional metric of looking at this metric. Here we're using one of the key value pairs that we have created already. And to see the creation of them, if you go to settings and you go to metrics rules, here's the one that I'm referring to. So here is this rule that is taking each metric and just parsing it out into a node name and so on and so forth, a pod name, a metric name, and et cetera. And once those are created, now we can start to utilize them. And so now if we want to go ahead and say, look at the success count in a new metric search, we can just very simply use the syntax of type is equal to bookings, metric is equal to success count, and now we see that same success graph. But we can do this for our failed bookings as well. Instead of doing that whole kind of long string like I did up here, just say type equals fail. And now I'm looking at my successful bookings and my failed bookings together. And if we start to look at these in the framework of travel logic, what we see here is, and keep in mind, we're just looking at a small period of time, but what we see here is people are booking, happy bookers, they're booking successfully, booking, booking, booking. Bookings start to drop. And when they start to drop, now we see failed bookings. Now, what we can do in doing the travel logic demo is we then start to look at that correlation of, well, when bookings went down, failed bookings went up. Why? And now we can start to use the logs and the metrics to figure out maybe the booking service is down. Maybe one of the pieces of it is down. Maybe. But now we can start to do that. All right, so let's go ahead and let's see, for lab 8, a couple more exercises here. Might as well play with these, just more hands-on. In step 9 here, we can look at the metrics associated to latency mean. So take it, paste it. And now we're looking at latency mean over the last 60 minutes. But now we see here's the latency mean for this source host, and here's for this one, and this one, all these different hosts. Now what we can do once again is start to do a time shift here to compare it to another time period. Here, this one is really low, which is actually good. It has a low latency. Well, what did it have yesterday at this time? And now we start to see both. Here we see 1 day, meaning yesterday, and then we see, well, they're kind of mixed together because they're going to be the same. We're in a test environment. We're duplicating data, so a lot of the data just replicates. But that's what we're seeing here is yesterday the latency was the same as it is today, which is good. It's consistent. It's static. And then as a reminder, we've looked at these a little bit already, but that metrics have a mix of operators that are similar to logs in that you can use min, max, sum, count, average. And we've looked at a couple of those already. But we can look at here, so let's look at the metric. So what I'm going to look at for this one, this is 9 and 10, still lab 8, but steps 9 and 10. I'm going to look at packets received. So do another new metric. Look at packets received. So now I see how many packets received granularly in 5-second buckets over the last 15 minutes. Now that's one way to look at this data. But what if I want to, instead of looking at just the number of packets received or the count of packets received, I want to look at the difference between one data point and the next. Well, that is going to be expressed using delta. So what I can do is copy this, paste it in, hit enter. And actually, I'll get rid of this other query. But now what I see is the delta. Rather than just seeing things going up and down with 0 being the lowest value, here it's looking at one point, it's looking at another point, and then showing us the difference from one to another. So in this case, I can actually have negative numbers because the rate could decrease in that respect. Now, another way to look at this data is to look at the rate of change. And so now, instead of looking at delta, I can say look at rate. And now it's going to start to utilize this, a different scale. Same data, we're still, in all 3 cases, we're looking at packets received. It's just how are we looking at that? Are we looking at it as a count, as a sum, as a delta, as a, so on and so forth. And that's what these options are giving to you. Different ways to look through this data. And then what we want to show here is how you can start to utilize your logs to use the ULM, as we call Unified Logs and Metrics environment. Because as it says up here, metrics are seeing the what's going on. Logs are going to help us see the why. So if we go back to our example here, not this one, the other one, this one. So right now we see, as I described earlier, we see booking successful, and then we see a drop in bookings. And I'm going to make this a little bit larger time frame just to hopefully illustrate this better. So here we see booking successful, we see a drop in bookings, and then we see failed bookings correspondingly. Well, I see what's going on. Bookings are going up and down, but I don't know why it's happening. So what I want to do now is I want to bring in some logs. Specifically, I want to bring in the logs associated with my checkout service, because I think that might be relevant to this use case. And I want to specifically look for errors in those checkout logs. And that's what the heat map at the top is going to represent. The heat map is showing me, based in these quantizations, these buckets, and these are 1-minute buckets, how many log messages that had the word error in it match. So what we see here at 9:30 is we see people are booking successfully and we see no errors. 9:58, people booking successfully and no errors. But look at this, at 10 o'clock or 10:01, we see a decrease in successful bookings, and we see a lot of errors. In fact, we see 324 log messages that have the word error in it, or string error in it. And what we can do here is now we can use this unified logs and metrics environment to now drill into the logs. Because now we see what is happening, but why is it happening? Now we can start to look through these logs and start to figure out, what might be going wrong. And in the TravelLogic demo, we go down that path, but I'm not going to go through it right now. But what I want to show is the fact that you can start to look at your logs, look at your metrics, look at them together, and then go down one path to try and figure out what has gone wrong or gone right. I mean, we always, of course, talk about things going wrong, warning messages, but all this stuff can be used to let you know about sales that are occurring, an increase in sales or orders or what have you. So it's not always negative data, but usually. All right, so that's lab 8. Let's see, let me go back to slide deck just to keep me honest again. The next use case we want to look at is logs to metrics. So we've been talking about metrics today. We've been talking about it a lot. We've been talking about bringing metrics into Sumo Logic. But what this feature allows you to do is to take your logs and turn them or convert them into metrics. Now, why would you ever want to do such a thing? So as it says here, logs to metrics is a feature that converts the results of a log search to a metric view. So that's what I just said, but why would we ever want to do this? Well, 3 reasons. And actually, there's going to be a 4th one. That's probably going to be the more important one. The first one is analyzing time. Time series data is going to be quicker to analyze than data that needs to be parsed and queried, unstructured data. So metrics are just usually faster to read. They're smaller, they're faster, quicker, all those adjectives. Retention period is done a little bit differently. So metrics are going to be retained for 13 months by default, which is really good for those key performance indicators that are going to be more looking at long-term ranges, so that you can bring this data, let it sit, and access it as needed. And then alerting. So with the real-time metrics, there's an alerting engine that we'll look at that provides some additional flexibility for those alerts, letting you know about critical or warning thresholds, data that's missing, and things like that. Now, another reason why metrics are preferred to logs, and why you'd want to take your logs and turn them into metrics, is metrics are simply less verbose or smaller. And that's what we kind of mean by performance, but I want to explain it in another way. Metrics will be smaller, they will take up less space, and so if you're paying per space, which you usually are, metrics can cost you less. So what we found is our customers will take those logs, turn them into metrics, not all of them, but some of them, and I want to show how you do it in a moment, but take them, turn them into metrics, keep them stored as metrics, and then they're essentially just not paying as much, which is certainly a good thing for our customers, of course. So let's go ahead and look at how this occurs. So in lab 9, we're going to look at that. So in lab 9, we have a use case of, we're going to use Apache data for this one. So we're going to use our logs of Apache data. If you've joined other classes, we use Apache data a lot. I like it as a good source of data. So in this case, we have our logs of Apache data, and we want to turn them into metrics and then utilize those metrics in the metric query. So that's the goal here. So let's start with this rule. So to set these up, we're going to go to Manage Data Settings. So Manage Data in the black bar, Settings in the black bar. And specifically, we are going to go to Logs to Metrics. Now, there may be a Logs to Metrics rule there. Actually, there should be one that I created, I think yesterday I was testing. But now we're going to create some of our own. So how do we do it? Well, we kind of fill in the blanks, but of course, it's a touch more advanced than that, but not too much more. So to create one, we're going to just click on the plus sign. And we're going to fill in the blanks. So the first thing is we want to give this a name. And the name can be anything, just a identifiable name. So I'm just going to call mine Apache L2M, Logs to Metrics. For the scope, we need to tell the system what set of data we want this rule to apply to. And so we're going to use the metadata and specifically the source category here to say, look at our labs Apache access data. So I'm going to grab that portion and just paste it into the scope. Now, the next part is we have all this data, and we actually start to see all this data in the preview parse expression down below. So what this is showing us is a real-time view into what we're inputting up above. So right now, it's showing us our lab Apache access data, which we see here. So each one is a lab Apache access message. But we need to tell the system what the different portions of that message are. Here's an IP address. Here's a status code. Here's a URL. But I need to tell the system how to identify those things. So what I can do here is I can use a parse expression that either I created on my own or that Sumo Logic is going to provide you. And I'd encourage using the ones we provide you, it's easier. But I'm just going to copy this and paste it in. When I paste it in, that is going to impact my real-time preview pane. So now what I should see are all those fields that I created. Here's a field for source IP. Here's a field for status code. Here's a field for URL, and so on and so forth. So now we've started to identify the structure of these log messages. So we have the logs, we have the structure of the logs of where the specific fields and values are, but now we need to turn those into metrics. And the way we do it here, and it's a little weird, but it does work and it does make sense, is we have two sections here. We have the portion so here we have all the fields that we've represented in the parse statement. And now what we need to do is start to identify these fields as metrics or end dimensions. So a metric is going to be the numeric value we want to calculate over time, while the dimensions are going to be any fields we want to slice and dice our data. So the metric we want to look at is size, because what we want to do here is we want to look at the size of, and I should have mentioned this earlier, the goal is to create a metric called size and measure it over time. So we're going to make the metric the size. And then the dimension is going to allow us to choose what do we want to slice and dice this data by. Well, you know what? In this case, I want to slice and dice it by status code, because I might want to see how many sizes or the sizes that correspond to 200 status codes, the sizes that correspond to 404s and 403s and 300s and yada, yada, yada. So I'm going to go ahead and make my status code a dimension. And now I'm going to click Save. Actually, before I click Save, excuse me, I do need to estimate the DPMs. And DPMs are data points per minute. What the DPMs are basically telling you is how much you are potentially going to be billed for this. So with logs, I don't want to get too bogged down in the details of how we do billing. One, I'm not a salesperson, so I don't know the fine details, but we bill you on essentially space, how much space you use. With metrics, we bill you on these DPMs, these data points per minute, which is a different way of billing you. And so what we're showing you here is how much estimated data points are going to be utilized from this rule, and then how many you've purchased. And you can purchase more, and you can talk to your reps about getting some free space to try the metrics and things like that. But now that I've clicked Estimate DPM, now I can click Save. Now that I've clicked save, there should be 2 rules, or you may possibly have more, but now I have these rules here. So now we want to see these rules. I created this rule, I created this conversion from a log to a metric, but now let me see it, let me use it, let me make it tangible. And that's what I'm doing right here. So what I'm doing with this line is I'm going to create a new metric search. And to identify that metric, I'm just going to say metric equals size. And the status code is the dimension. So I'm using my metric and my dimension here. And so before I put the status code, actually, if I run the metric equal to size, I see all these different metrics. But since I wanted to use the status code as a field that I want to parse on or filter on, now I can say status code equals, and the search ahead even helps me with it. So I could say, you know what, just show me the status code equals 404. And now what I see is that particular metric of size corresponding to 404s over the last 15 minutes. So I'm seeing these metrics of sizes rather than looking at logs. And it's saving me money because these are cheaper to house. Similarly, we could take the metric equal size and average it by status code. So what we should get here, let me turn off that first one, is now we get for each status code, and there's a lot of them, we get the average for each one. And since there's a lot of them, that's why it's quite busy. So. All right, so I wanted to show that because 1, it's a newer feature for us. 2, it's a helpful feature in that it can actually save you cost in that you don't have to house these expensive metrics. And then, as I showed earlier, with all the other benefits, it's going to be faster. It allows for alerting. We'll take a look at the alerting in a moment, but it does allow for those things. So speaking of alerting and monitoring, that's the last section we have to cover today. So monitoring metrics, how do you monitor them? Well, you have 2 different ways to monitor them, and similar to logs. You can create a dashboard. So as I showed, you have your graph here. Actually, I didn't show how to make it a dashboard. Let me do it real fast, just for those of you that have not seen this. So here I have this, let me pick a better one. So here I have this chart, this graph that's showing me information, about metrics related to count. Now let's say this is really helpful to me. What I can do is I can choose to add this to a dashboard. So I can create a panel, I can create a dashboard. I'm just going to use just randomness. And now I have a dashboard with my panel. And so what I can start to do is toggle the theme, and hopefully you've seen things like this before. I can add a text panel. Sorry, clicking too much. I can add a text panel. Test, this is a size chart. Let me move this around. All right, and now I'm done editing. And now I can share this with other people in my organization. Same way I would share any other dashboard. A dashboard can consist of logs and metrics. It doesn't have to just be one or the other. So I could bring in some logs in here as well. But wanted to show the dashboard because if you haven't seen it, it's quite important as an easy way to express data. But let's go back to the monitoring, but specifically focusing around the metric monitors. And that's what we want to show here. So the metrics monitors allow you to keep an eye on those critical events that are taking place and be notified about them. So let's go ahead and take a look at the metrics monitors in the application and set one up. As you'll see, it's quite easy to set up. It's quite, not obvious, but the steps are pretty straightforward, but let's go ahead and do these together. So let me get out of the deck, get into the labs, lab 10, and let's create one together. Now, like I just showed, I showed how to create a dashboard. So we just went through that step, but now let's look at the metrics monitors. So to create one, first we're going to create just some metrics that we want to look at. We can use ones that we've created already, but I'm going to follow along with the lab. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this query. go to a new metric search and paste it in. And let me just do some more time. Let's see, why am I not getting data? Oh, container star. Sorry about that. So what the error is, and I'll correct this, I apologize, but it should be, as it shows in the image, container equals container with a star after the container or a wildcard. So I apologize for that little typo in that lab, and I'll correct that. But now if you added that star, now what you should start to get are some metrics. And that's really what we want to show, just some metrics here. Now what we want to do is start to create a monitor or an alert from these metrics. So how do we create it? Well, as it says here, we're just going to click on the alert icon to the right of the query. So to the right of the query, click on that icon. And now it's a lot of essentially fill in the blanks. So here is the time series we want to monitor. And what we can now start to do is start to develop those thresholds of when we want to be monitored. So for example, we can start to add these thresholds right here. So do we want to be alerted right away? We can start to set these values, and that's exactly what we're going to do now. So if we go back to the lab, we want to set an alert of critical for when the metric of any time series is greater than 90 for all of the last 15 minutes. So if we want to go ahead and do that, we can add threshold for critical, 90 for last 15 minutes. And you can play with whatever values you want to put in here. And then I could send a notification, as it says here, send alerts at sumologic.com. That's going to send a critical alert, which is good, but maybe I want to get an alert, a warning alert, just if we hit 80% for the last 15 minutes. Or 85, or whatever. And I can start to set these. So now a warning alert will go if I hit 80%, but if I get 90%, then a critical alert will go. And I can also set up different groups. I could say, for this 90%, my ops team needs to get involved, because if they're hitting 90%, something's gone wrong. However, if we're just hitting 80%, maybe just, maybe everybody does need to know about that, or vice versa. And so you can start to customize those. And then also for missing data as well. And so once I go ahead and click save, oh, I need to enter the monitor name. So this is just going to be a description. I'm just going to call it, I'm just going to use my initials. Oops, sorry about that. And then save it. And now, as you see here, this rule is being created. It's going to take a few moments for it to kind of kick in. And now it's going to start to monitor. So here for this other rule that Marie made last week, or earlier this week, her rule is looking at other stuff, and her status is good. Everything's okay. Now my rule will start to show, potentially things not being okay after periods of time. So we have the ability for you to be notified via the alerts, getting an email or some other mechanism, but then also looking at the metric monitors themselves and just saying, hey, everything's good. If this was red, that's bad, and we need to fix it or work on it. So I wanted to show the metrics monitors as a method of looking at or monitoring things. Unfortunately, at this point, there's not a logs monitor version. There actually should be, because it would be kind of easier to do. Although that's one of the advantages of metrics, is you can look at this data in this way. But did want to show that. All right, so that really wraps up everything I wanted to go over about metrics. I know we threw a lot at you today. Hopefully, some of this was useful. As we do with all of our courses, I expect for today, this was to introduce a lot of metrics concepts to you. I don't expect you to leave today and immediately remember how to set up a log to metric, although if you do, that's great. But what I do want you to gain from these classes is, down the road, if you ever want to do this, the documentation is there, it's thorough, you have the labs as well to play with these things and, implement them in your system and see how they work. Use the training environment as well. So this environment is available to you after today. So even if you're not ingesting metrics and you just want to get a little deeper and start to play with them, I mean, this is a perfect interface for that. The training environment is built for that. So the last portion of today will be taking the certification exam. So as a reminder, you will not want to take the exam. Actually, two reminders. Excuse me, two reminders here. First one, unrelated to the exam. What I would encourage you to do, actually, let's do this together, or let me show you how to do this together, is I would encourage you to delete the collectors and delete them in two ways. The first is I'd encourage you to go to your device and actually delete the collector. It has an uninstall, so going to applications, going to collector, uninstalling it. The other thing I would do is go to manage data, go to collection, go to your collector, and then choose to delete it. The reason being, just in transparency, is if you leave the session today and the collector is still running on your laptop, we are still collecting data from your laptop and bringing it into your training environment, which is fine for you to do, but I want you to at least be aware that it's occurring. So if you don't want that to happen, which I understand, go ahead and just make sure you delete those collectors. So that's one thing. So please do that eventually. And the other thing is, for the exam itself, you're going to want to make sure that you log out of your training credentials and log in with your corporate or professional account. And then when you log in, go to certification, go to metrics mastery, and click take the exam. There's as if you've taken exams before, 30 questions, multiple choice, you have an hour. Everything is open book, so open book, open documentation, open Google. And so, yeah, well, let's go through these labs, or excuse me, through the exam, sorry. I'll stay on the line for a few moments. I'm gonna throw myself on mute just to take a quick bio break, but if there's any questions, go ahead and let me know. But otherwise, certainly thank you for joining. I'll send out an email, try to do it after this call, but then, yeah, by the end of the day, I'll send an email to you guys that attended with the slide deck, just in case you want to have that and look at that. But thank you for attending. Any feedback you have as well, if you want to reply to that email that I send you, would be helpful as well. So yeah, so I'll go ahead and put you guys on mute, or I'll put myself on mute. And yeah, good luck to everybody, and thank you for joining. Hope you found this helpful.